This is a new book by co-authors John Earl Haynes and Harvey Clare. They build on their earlier research about communist spying with this book, Venona, Decoding Soviet Espionage in America. The authors provide a detailed study of how the U.S. decrypted top-secret communist messages sent between Washington and Moscow during the Cold War. Mr. Haynes spoke about the book during a visit to the National Archives in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Archives. My name is Sam Anthony, and I'm your host for today's lecture and book signing. We are pleased to have with us Dr. John Earl Haynes as he will be discussing his book, Venona, Decoding Soviet Espionage in America. A few points before we begin. We have numerous copies of our June calendar spread around the room on your seats on the tables. Please take them. They are free. If you would like to have these calendars mailed to your home or work, there is a sign-up sheet outside where books are being sold. On that point, we have copies of this book for sale outside. At the end of this lecture, Dr. Haynes will be in the back signing copies. The format for today, Dr. Haynes will speak. We will have a brief question and answer session afterwards, and then we will conclude with the book signing. John Haynes has had an impressive career and a list of credits that just is incredible. He received his bachelor's degree in history from Florida State, his master's degree and his doctorate in history from the University of Minnesota. He has worked in the Armed Services Committee in the United States Senate, the House Appropriations Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives, and since 1987 he has been with the Library of Congress, where he is the 20th century political historian and a member of the Manuscript Division. Along the way, he was editor of the Newsletter for Historians of American Communism and president of this group from 1992 to 1995. His works are numerous and include such titles as Calvin Coolidge and the Coolidge Era, Essays on the Histories of the 1920s, The Soviet World of American Communism, and the American Communism Movement Storming Heaven Itself. Would you please welcome John Haynes.
Thank you, Mr. Anthony, and my thanks to the National Archives for having this program. Let me start by describing briefly my own road to Venona. When I was a young history graduate student, I never had any intentions of becoming a historian of espionage. I'm not even sure it's a field that I was even aware of as a field of historical writing. My interest at that time as a graduate student was in the history of the American labor movement and the American working class. And in fact, my earliest work dealt with timber worker strikes in northern Minnesota organized by the industrial workers of the world prior to there even being a Bolshevik revolution and a communist movement. But after I finished my master's work in 1968, I had a bit of time on my hand, and I got involved in political campaigns in Minnesota for the Humphrey for President Committee, and went to work for that committee in 1968. In 1969, that particular position led to my getting a job as a researcher for the Liberal Caucus in the state Senate. And that position led in 1970 to a position on the campaign staff of State Senator Wendell Anderson, who was running for governor of Minnesota. He won, and in 1971 I joined his gubernatorial staff as his advisor on tax and school finance policy. I spent the next few years chiefly working on tax and school finance policy, and it was 3 or 4 years before I was able to get back to my graduate work, though not on a full-time basis. In looking around for something to work on for my dissertation, I wanted something which was in the field that still chiefly interested me, on the history of the American Union movement. But of course, I had now spent, at this point, about 8 years heavily involved in the politics of Minnesota and the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, of which I was a member. And I thought I would look at something which had come up in my mind as I talked to veteran DFL politicians in the state, which was the early history of the party. Some of you may know, probably most of you don't, there's no reason you really should. In Minnesota, the official name of the Democratic Party is the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. When Bill Clinton ran for president in Minnesota last time, in the last election, he was not the candidate of the Democratic Party. He was listed on the ballot as the candidate of the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. It is a merged party that resulted in 1944 between the merger of the state's Democratic Party, which was the third largest party in the state, and the state's Farmer Labor Party, which at that time was the second largest party in the state, and which had in the 1930s been the largest party in the state. Much of the history of the DFL is connected to the career of Hubert Humphrey. He established his ascendancy over the party in 1948, and essentially the party as I knew it when I came into its work in the late 1960s was a party that he had largely created, or men and women associated with him had created in the 1950s. But of course I knew there was a history of the DFL prior to Humphrey's leadership, prior to 1948. And I had gotten an impression from some discussions with veteran DFLers, as Democrats in Minnesota are often called, that unions of the AFL and the CIO, and this is prior to the merger of the two federations, had played a very lively role in the tumultuous 4 early years of the DFL from 1944 to 1948. So I thought I would combine my interest in labor history with my involvement in DFL politics and do a dissertation on the role of Minnesota unions in the first 4 years of the Democratic Farmer Labor Party's existence. Now, one thing I had heard from some of the veteran DFLers, as they talked about those days, men and women who had been part of the original Humphrey group in the late 40s, they talked about how Hubert had thrown the Reds out of the party in 1948. Well, I knew that that couldn't be true. Because as a graduate student and in my historical instruction and my reading, I had certainly received the definite impression that there were no Reds in mainstream politics. Certainly there had been an American Communist Party, but the idea that there had been a significant presence of communists in mainstream politics was silly, ridiculous, even paranoid. So I knew these old DFLers, well, I was a little embarrassed by it, but I just sort of decided they must be a slang expression reflecting differences over early Cold War policies between Harry Truman and Henry Wallace, because I just could not conceive of there actually being real Reds in the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party. Well, I started my research, and I like ample archival resources. I like to have lots of things to work with, and in the case of my particular topic, there were ample resources available. The Minnesota Historical Society is a very fine institution and has very large collections. The records of the DFL and of the Farmer Labor Party for that period were both at the Historical Society. The records of the Central Labor Union of Minneapolis, which was the AFL central body, and the Trades and Labor Assembly of St. Paul, which was the AFL central body for that city, as well as the records of several of the largest CIO unions in the state were available for research, as well as the papers of some of the leading personalities in politics in that era. Well, as I looked into the material, it became increasingly clear to me that those old veteran DFLers knew what they were talking about, and I was the one who was not well informed. There actually were a lot of Reds in the DFL in its early years. And I also discovered that it was not some kind of factional fight that went on in the late, from 1944 to 1948. It was not a factional fight that had started at the merger. As I looked at the material, it was clear that there had been a factional battle inside Minnesota's Farmer Labor Party from the mid-30s. And the factional battle in the DFL was but a new chapter in a battle between an anti-communist faction or factions and a Popular Front faction, of which the Communist Party was a leading and controlling element. Well, that led to my dissertation shifting direction and being more of a political history. and less of a labor history. And also led me to, not through any intention, but simply by opportunity, to devote a great deal of my historical research efforts to the issues of American communism and anti-communism, because I found there was lots of information available. Not an awful lot of historians were writing in that area, particularly not in terms of communism and mainstream politics. So I began to look at it. In many areas of history, it's hard to find something that someone hasn't already written about over and over again. I found an area where not that many people were writing, and I thought it was delightful to not have an awful lot of competition. Well, that led eventually to my association with my co-author in this book, Harvey Clare, who also wrote on American communism. We co-authored a book together that was published in 1992, The American Communist Movement Storming Heaven Itself, a one-volume history of the party. But just as we were publishing that book, the world of historical research in this area took a drastic change. The Soviet Union collapsed, and Russian archives, not all of them, but some of them, became open for research. And it was at that point that my colleague Harvey Clare made his first trip to Moscow and found at the Central Party Archive of the Soviet Communist Party that the records of the Communist International, the Soviet agency that had supervised foreign parties, was open for research, and it contained many thousands of files on the American communist movement. Harvey brought back copies of much of this material, and he and I were going over it when we learned that Yale University Press was beginning a series of books, largely document-based books, on material at this and other Russian archives, chiefly aimed, of course, at material on the history of the Soviet communist movement. But we thought, well, as long as we know there's a lot of material on the American Party there, why don't we suggest to Yale that they include some volumes on the American Communist Movement as well. We made the proposal. Yale accepted. And they contacted the Russian archives, who are partners in the Annals of Communism series. They thought it was a fine idea to include some books on the American Party. And they also wrote Yale that, by the way, were they aware that not only did they have the Comintern archives, the records of the American Communist Party itself were also available. And our editor at Yale, Jonathan Brent, contacted us, and we said, well, no one knew they were there. There were always rumors that the American Party had shipped their records to Moscow, but those were just rumors or apocryphal tales, is the kind of thing you might think, but no one knew that. It was simply a possibility. So, well, of course, that made the prospects of these volumes even more interesting. And at that point, I made my first trip to Moscow to look to see whether the Russians were right. Did they really have the American Communist Party's own records? Or were these just a lot of copies of some reports, back issues of the Daily Worker, and such as that? And it was in January of 1993, and I was sitting in a room at the archive when they wheeled in the first cartload of these files. They said these files had actually been stored at a warehouse in western Siberia because there was no call on them at their archive in the old days, so they had just stored them away. So they arrived really desk-covered. And most of these files are the kind of files that, they have a flap that goes over and a ribbon that you tie it with. So, I picked up these files and undid the ribbon and quite literally blew the dust off these files and looked inside, and they weren't copies. These were the original records. Carbons of outgoing messages, the original incoming letters from party organizers all around the country, routine bureaucratic reports from various agencies of the party, records that had been created in America and then shipped secretly to Moscow many decades ago. Well, that led to two books that we did for Yale University Press as part of the series, The Secret World of American Communism, that was published in 1995, and The Soviet World of American Communism, which was published last year, 1998. That research also led us to Venona. Now, we had not gone to Moscow expecting to find material on espionage, because the archive where we were working, the Central Party Archive, which has subsequently been renamed. By the way, Russians like very long names for their archives. And the new name of this archive is the Russian Center for the Preservation and Study of Documents of Recent History. In the old days, it was the Central Party Archive of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And before that, it even had a longer name. But in any event, this was an archive that had Soviet party records from the time of the Bolshevik Revolution till Stalin's death, and the records of the Communist International, which existed officially until 1943 when it was dissolved. It did not have the records of Soviet espionage agencies. Those were in a different archive. The records of the KGB and its predecessors were under the control of a new Russian intelligence agency, the SVR. It regarded those records as its records, not those of a long past and now dead agency, and it wasn't letting anyone in to its archive. Similarly, the records of Soviet military intelligence, which is a separate arm of Soviet intelligence, were part of the records of the Russian army, and they regarded those as their records, and they weren't letting anyone into the GRU archives. So we had no particular expectation or plans to find espionage material in the records of the American Party or of the Comintern, because that kind of material we would expect to find in the closed archives of the intelligence agencies. But we did find some material that, once we took a look at it, led us to reconsider exactly what we were looking at. Sam, if you could put on the number 9 transparency. Among the material we brought back from the Comintern were a number of messages in Russian, and neither Harvey Clare nor I either speaks or read very good Russian, because in the old days we never expected to be doing any research at Russian archives, and we never expected the Soviet Union to collapse, and so what was the point of learning Russian if you're interested in American communism? Well, we were wrong about that. But we did bring back these documents in Russian and sent them to a decent translator, because we could make out enough. We knew this stuff seemed interesting. And there were a number of messages to Georgy Dimitrov, who was head of the Comintern. And these messages they weren't on a letterhead. They were on plain paper. This was, wartime, World War II in the Soviet Union, and they didn't always go with the niceties of letterhead. And it was simply a plain paper, a message marked top secret. There were several dozen of them. And they were to Dimitrov, and they were asking questions, and they were signed by Fitton. Well, one of the messages, the one that's up there right now, asked Dimitrov to provide what information the Comintern had on the following members of the Comparty, which was a Comintern acronym for Communist Party, Comparty of America. And it lists 7 people. Well, both Claire and I recognized all the names on that list, and we were particularly aware that 6 of the 7 had been named by a Soviet defector, Elizabeth Bentley, as having been members of an underground party unit that had been transferred to the control of the KGB, actually one of its predecessors under another acronym, in 1944. And here we have a message from some guy named Fitton to Dimitrov asking about 6 of the 7 people that Elizabeth Bentley had named as having been transferred to Soviet intelligence control in 1944 from the American Party. Well, as I said, neither Claire nor I was a historian of Soviet intelligence, and we didn't immediately recognize the name Fitton. But just from the context, we thought, well, maybe we better find out who Fitton is. And it didn't take us very long. Actually, Harvey was down in Atlanta and I was here in Washington. We were on the phone, and we said we better figure out who Fitton is, and why don't we look at our various books on the history of the KGB. And I forget which of us found the right book first, but we found out that Pavel Fitton was General Pavel Fitton was the head of the Foreign Intelligence Directorate of the KGB from 1939 until 1945. And so what this message looks like is a vetting message, that indeed the KGB was taking on these people as sources and was revetting the network, that is, checking out their backgrounds before fully recruiting them. And it would be a natural thing, since they are American communists, for the KGB to send a message asking for a check of Comintern records to see if the Comintern had any information about these particular people. So what we discovered is that in the Comintern records were fragments of the KGB's records, communications from the KGB to the Comintern about matters of mutual concern. We also found, and this is what actually put us directly on the road to Venona, you might say, another Fitton message. If you put on transparency number 1. Again, a Fitton to Dimitrov record asking about some Americans. It's the first name that struck us, Judy Coplin. Judy Coplin was arrested in the late 1940s by the FBI when handing over a file of government documents to a Soviet diplomat at the UN who was a Soviet intelligence officer. She was tried twice for espionage, convicted twice for espionage, but in each case an appeals court returned the case for retrial on the grounds that some of the evidence used to convict her was not admissible. The court said the evidence is damning and the evidence is just fine, but you can't use it in court for technical legal reasons. Eventually the government dropped the case because it could not figure out how to get the evidence admitted. What was of interest to us, and which led indirectly to this Venona book, is that Robert Lamphere, a retired FBI agent who had worked in counterintelligence for many years, had talked about the Judith Coplin case in a memoir, and he had said that the FBI was put on the trail to Coplin and decided to institute surveillance on her because of a deciphered Soviet intelligence cable that it had access to, that the government had decoded. Now, he didn't describe the code breaking project very much, but he also said the same project had put them on the road to Klaus Fuchs, the British physicist who was part of the Manhattan Project in the United States to build the atomic bomb. And of course, the Fuchs case had eventually led to the arrest and jailing in the United States of Harry Gold and David Greenglass for their participation in Soviet espionage, and to the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg for espionage, as well as the jailing of Morton Sobel. So obviously this decoding project must have been extremely important, but Lamphere, aside from briefly mentioning it in the case of Coplin and the atomic espionage cases, hadn't gone into any details about it. But there were some discussions of this decoding project in some other books. In regard to the Rosenbergs, again without giving it a name, Ron Radosh and Joyce Milton, in their history of the Rosenberg case, the Rosenberg Files, the name of their book, they had run across documents that indicated that some deciphered Soviet cable traffic had been key to the road that led the FBI to the arrest of Fuchs and the Rosenbergs. In a history of American intelligence by David Martin, the project was actually briefly described and named Venona, though whether that was a cover name or an acronym that stood for something wasn't made particularly clear. But there was not much in the book about exactly what Venona had discovered. Well, we were very curious about this, even though we weren't historians of espionage and intelligence. We had run across this material, so we decided we ought to try to follow it up. We did make some inquiries about Venona, and we essentially ran into a stone wall. One official that I talked to who had some connections with American intelligence told me, yes, there had been a Venona project and it dealt with Soviet espionage in World War II. Yes, it produced a lot of valuable material, and no, you'll never look at it, and neither will anyone else, because signals intelligence is simply too sensitive to be made public, so forget about it. Well, that was very frustrating, but that sometimes happens when you deal with modern history. And it was at that point, from our point of view, a lucky accident happened. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan read our first book, The Secret World of American Communism, where we mentioned the Copland message. We mentioned what little we knew about Venona, which wasn't a great deal, and as well as other material that we had come across dealing with the underground operations of the American Communist Party. Well, Moynihan liked the book. He called me up and to discuss some points in it. And he also said that he was shortly going to be heading up a commission. The title of the commission is Commission on the Protection and Reduction of Government Secrecy. It had, I think, 12 members, 8 appointed by the Senate, 12 members, 4 appointed by the Senate, 4 by the House, and 4 by the President. Moynihan was the chairman. The purpose of the commission was a theme that Moynihan was pursuing at that time, to look at a change in American policy and American laws dealing with classified information and secrecy. It was Moynihan's position at the end of the Cold War suggested that the regime of secrecy we had set up during the Cold War could be reviewed and changed in light of the new circumstances. Moynihan felt that in order to make that point to his fellow commission members, he also had to explain a bit historically about why the regime of secrecy of the Cold War was created in the first place. So he said he was getting copies of our book, The Secret World of American Communism, for all members of the commission. Well, of course, I thought that was wonderful. He also asked if Claire and I could testify to the commission about our research. Well, we were delighted to do so. He also asked whether there were any particular points that he might try to bring out in some of the questioning and things to look at. And after thinking about it for a while, I suggested, well, he might ask about Venona. That's something that we thought should be followed up on. Well, the commission met. We got up and testified, and there were a number of questions from members of the commission. Senator Moynihan had some questions and some points he wanted to make of things that he thought should be brought up. And then he asked us if we could tell what we knew about Venona, and that didn't take long, 5 minutes. That's everything we knew. What we tried to do in that response was note here we had come across in a Russian archive a message which seemed to deal with what little we knew about Venona. And it seemed a little strange that we could actually find something on Venona, or it seemed to be related to Venona, in an open Russian archive, and we couldn't find anything here in the U.S. in any open archive. And from what we understood, and we didn't know whether it was true or not, virtually everything in the Venona project, whatever it was over 50 years old, and we had trouble understanding why it could not yet be made public. Well, Moynihan then turned to the man who was sitting on his right, John Deutsch, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, who was one of the presidential appointees, and said he wanted the DCI, that was Deutsch's official title, Director of Central Intelligence, to talk to the NSA and find out why Venona couldn't be made public. Well, Deutsch didn't make any promises, but he said he'd look into it. Well, I tell you, I certainly never expected anything to happen, because I thought even though Senator Moynihan is a formidable figure, the stone wall that I'd run into, I figured would continue. It was then the total surprise to me that something like 6 weeks or 8 weeks later, I got a call from Moynihan's office to come out to the CIA the next day for a press conference. Venona was being opened up. Well, indeed it was, and from a historical point of view, it was delightful. It is a project that turns out to have decoded nearly 3,000 cables between Soviet intelligence offices in the U.S. And as well as some from other nations as well, to Moscow and Moscow back to the U.S. During World War II, most of them in 1943, 44, and 45, but a few as late as 1948. The actual details of the Venona project we tried to describe in the book. And let me mention that while Venona plays a very key role in this book, after all, we did name it Venona, but it is a book that attempts to lay out the main contours of Soviet espionage in the U.S. in the 1930s and 40s, and it brings together not only the information provided by Venona, but also attempts to immerse it in and connect it to the information which is available from other sources, such as the testimony of defectors from Soviet intelligence like Elizabeth Bentley and Whittaker Chambers and others, with testimony and evidence provided in various court actions, such as the Hiss case and others. Testimony provided before congressional committees back in the late 40s and 1950s. Files of FBI investigations, which have slowly over the past 10 years become available under the Freedom of Information Act, particularly the very massive file that was given the name the Silvermaster file, as well as an early, very large FBI look at Soviet espionage, the Comintern apparatus investigation, as well as material from various government agencies, including material here at the National Archives that we used, chiefly records of the OSS and State Department records, as well as material from Russian archives, because as I said, we did find intelligence-related material in the records of the Comintern. And then finally, at the final stages of the project of writing this, there came available, from our point of view, indirectly, some KGB documents which had provided to Alan Weinstein and which became part of his book that was published earlier this year, The Haunted Wood. An excellent book, and I would recommend those of you interested in the area to take a look at it. Let me just hit on what I think are some key points that at least key points that struck me in the writing of this book, or perhaps points that were surprises to me. One is that it was no surprise that there had been Soviet espionage, but I was surprised, as we tried to put all of this together, at the massive size of the Soviet intelligence offensive. I had expected that there would be dozens, perhaps scores, of Americans working with Soviet intelligence. I did not expect hundreds. That was a surprise to me. It was not a surprise to me to find that there were a number of American communists who worked with Soviet intelligence and who were spies. It was not a surprise to me that the American Communist Party as an institution knew about it and had some role in it. But I had thought the relationship between the party and Soviet intelligence was an arm's-length relationship, that the party knew that Soviet intelligence recruited communists for espionage and winked at it and even encouraged it, and sometimes perhaps if they had some real hot prospect might even let Soviet intelligence know about it. But I'd thought that both Soviet intelligence and the American party would have regarded a close relationship between the two involving espionage to be too dangerous. I was wrong. In the 1930s and 1940s, the relationship between Soviet intelligence and the American party were extremely close. And the party as an institution worked as an auxiliary to Soviet intelligence. One of the things I discovered in this is that my conception of the relationship was really a conception based on the 1950s and 60s. when the American Party was under close scrutiny by the FBI and other counterintelligence agencies, and when indeed for it to function in the way it had in the 30s and 40s would have been highly risky both for it and for Soviet intelligence. But the projection backwards into the 30s and 40s of the situation of the 50s and later was a historical error. Another thing that was a bit of a surprise was to, and this is what makes the first part possible, is that American counterintelligence in the 1930s and early 40s missed most of this, in part because American counterintelligence was extremely small in the 30s, and when it got underway in a larger way in the 1940s, its chief targets were elsewhere. After all, for very good reasons, we were more concerned about Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan than we were at that time with the Soviet Union. It's also true, I think, that it takes some time to build up an effective counterintelligence apparatus, and it did take some time in this case. Once it was built up, and once the FBI and other agencies turned their attention to the Communist Party, the kind of arrangement that was possible in the 30s and 40s became impossible and dangerous and was ended. So those are, from my point of view, what are some of the high points. Let me also just, before we go to questions, put up a few more messages that deal with things. All right, the one we have right there is a Moscow document that Claire and I found in the records of the Comintern. We can match that with a Venona message, which is transparency number 2. This message is about recruiting Judy Coplin. And here is a Venona message made public just a few years ago discussing the formal recruitment of Judith Coplin. She has the cover name Sima. Number 3 now. These are translations of 2 documents found that we found in Russian archives, again the Comintern archive. A cover note from Lavriy Beria, the head of the predecessor to the KGB, to Dimitrov. It's really a cover note from Beria saying, I'm enclosing a telegram that we got from Earl Browder, the head of the American Communist Party, regarding a meeting he had with Pierre Coote, who was at that point an exiled French politician. It was at the time of the fall of France in 1940, and Coote had just arrived in the U.S. And what Browder is reporting is that Coote, who had been a member of several of the short-lived French governments in the late 1930s, was offering his services to the Soviet Union in this meeting. Obviously, it was something that was of interest both to Dimitrov of the Comintern, but of course this passed through KGB hands, and they paid attention to it as well, as is shown by the next transparency, a translated Venona message. Where a Soviet intelligence officer in the United States reports on his initial contact with Pierre Coote. And there are other messages dealing with that. Coote became a recruited Soviet source. Again, now number 5. A document we found in the records of the Communist International, where Fitton inquires about 2 members of the Communist Party. They're referred to in the translation as conspiratized members of the Comparty. Part of that's a translation awkwardness. Perhaps a better translation might be secret member of the party. That is, they were not public members, but secret members of the party. A man named Louis Horvitz and Paul Burns. And that matches up with the Venona message, which is in transparency number 6. where the New York office of the KGB is reporting to Moscow that it was establishing some safe houses for meetings, one an apartment of Horvitz and the other the apartment of Paul Burns. Obviously, the Moscow headquarters had decided to check on the background of the men that its New York office had decided to run some safe houses. Now, number 7. A Comintern document, again a fit-in message asking whether the Comintern had any information about 2 people. The second one, Marion Davis, who's listed as an employee of the American Embassy in Mexico. Actually, she worked in the Naval Intelligence, or rather the Naval Attaché office at the Embassy in Mexico. Now, number 8. Where you'll see down there, this is a discussion about recruiting Marion Davis as a source. This message also brings out, you'll see that in the last line, the Soviets believed the cipher they were using in this cable was unbreakable. Obviously, that turned out to be an error, but they believed it to be unbreakable. And for that reason, they, when it was convenient, they did not hesitate to use a real name in a message. You see that in the case of Marion Davis in that last line. You see that Marion Davis is there in her real name. It didn't require any figuring out who this was. Henceforth, Lou. That is, Lou will be Marion Davis's cover name from this point onward. And so the New York office is notifying Moscow that we're recruiting Marion Davis, and from now on, she will be known as Lou. Briefly put on number 9. That's the one we saw earlier, which was one of the first ones that suggested to Claire and I that we were looking at something related to intelligence. As I said, we knew at that point that 6 of the 7 people in this message Elizabeth Bentley had named as members of her espionage apparatus. Now, if we'll skip over to number 11. This is the Venona message, where the New York KGB reports on the very people that are discussed in that document, and as members of an apparatus that had been headed by Jacob Golos, who was Elizabeth Bentley's superior and lover. He had died. She had taken over the apparatus and was being transferred directly to KGB control. And this is a report about that meeting and the transfer, and people who are in that earlier document are discussed here. Now let me skip ahead just to give you a flavor of some of the Venona messages. Most of these messages do not contain the substance of intelligence. These are, after all, cables, telegrams. Actual copies of documents, detailed information, and that kind of thing is lengthy, runs for many pages. They didn't use cables for that. That stuff was sent by courier, by diplomatic pouch. The cables tend to be administrative reports notifying Moscow what is being sent, so that the Moscow office will know when the pouch arrives they can expect information about X, Y, and Z when it finally gets there. And in World War II, sometimes it would take a long time for a diplomatic pouch to get through. After all, communications between the U.S. And Moscow in World War II had to take circuitous routes at times. Only occasionally do the cables have a lot of the substance. And there is one that is rather interesting. We'd put on number 21. This is the 1943 message dealing with a project that in the KGB traffic is referred to as under the cover name Enormous. That was their cover name for what we call the Manhattan Project, our atomic bomb project. This cable is a report. It follows up an earlier one, which I didn't use here. about information being provided by someone who is given the cover name, here it's called Cavant. Actually, the translation of that is quantum. And this message actually contains the substance of some of the intelligence that quantum provided. The KGB was under an awful lot of pressure to provide information to Moscow on the atomic bomb project, and I think perhaps they were so delighted to have received the information they decided to actually send it by cable rather than waiting for the pouch. You see the first paragraph has some description of what it involves. Now if you put on number 22, it's the next page of this message. You see it's actually a scientific formula. What the formula is a scientific description of the method, one of the several methods that was being developed in the Manhattan Project for the separation of uranium isotopes, the separation of U-235 from U-238. U-235 can be used to build an atomic bomb. U-238 cannot. So separating the two is a key technical task to be performed. And it is not an easy task because, after all, they are isotopes of the same substance. One of the methods which was developed by the Manhattan Project was gaseous diffusion. This is a description of that method and of the physics and chemistry that is involved in it. The Soviets, by this point, actually had started a small atomic project. They had considered gaseous diffusion and thought it was impractical and were not pursuing it. This and other messages provided by other sources indicated to them that, in fact, gaseous diffusion was practical and laid out the method by which it could be pursued. Quantum is an unknown source. We don't know who quantum was. The message that initially discusses a meeting between quantum and Soviet intelligence only indicates that quantum met with a Soviet intelligence officer at the Russian embassy in 1943 and provided this information. There are several other messages that mention quantum, such as this one, about the information that quantum provided, but none of the other deciphered messages that we have mention quantum again. So there's simply not enough information provided for the FBI to identify quantum, and to this day, we don't know who quantum was. Quantum is also a little unusual in that the first message about him indicates that quantum, after he met with the intelligence officer, wanted to be paid. And that's unusual in these messages. Virtually all the sources that they developed in World War II were ideologically motivated. It was unusual to find an agent asking for funds. But quantum wanted money, and he got it. One assumes that the Soviets attempted to develop quantum as a productive source later than these 1943 messages. We simply don't have any deciphered messages discussing that, so we don't know. And I think it is important to remember that only a small portion of Soviet intelligence traffic was deciphered. So what we know is part of the picture, but only part. Well, with that, let me stop and see what kinds of questions you have.
Yeah, two questions. One, what is the designation ride that was on the top several of those messages instead of Venona, there was ride? Secondly, did the Russian archives seem to have been culled before they gave them to you, or were they raw? In other words, were all the documents in there, or had they gone through them and taken out certain documents, or do you know?
Well, on the first part, bride, the Venona messages themselves, when the project was started, it didn't have a particular name. It was referred to as the Russian project, the Russian diplomatic project. After they started actually deciphering some messages, the messages themselves were given a cover name and stamped with it. They went through three: bride, drug, and Venona. Venona was simply the last one, and over time it became known as the Venona project, but originally it was simply the cover name for the messages. Venona, by the way, doesn't stand for anything. It's not an acronym. It was a random name. One of the cryptanalysts who worked on the project I asked whether he knew why they picked Venona. And this man, Cecil Phillips, who just died a few months ago, Cecil said he doesn't remember clearly, but he thinks they had simply asked the library at NSA to send them a list of words, and that someone essentially put down a finger and it was on Venona, and that was it. But Cecil, he said, I'm not really clear about that, but he said it was something like it. It doesn't mean anything. So that's what I know about the bride and the drug. I presume someone picked those for some other kind of maybe similarly random meaning. As far as I know, it didn't mean anything. Now, as to the material in the Russian archives, in my own examination of Comintern records, I do think that at some point someone had attempted to remove intelligence-related material. I think the material that we found, these Fitton messages, was overlooked. And the reason I think it was overlooked is that after The Secret World of American Communism was published, and I went back to Moscow for some follow-up work on some other documents which we wished to use in our next volume, which was the Soviet World. The head of the archive, Kirill Anderson, who is the co-author of our book, The Soviet World of American Communism, Kirill Anderson, when he welcomed me to the archive, said, it was nice to see me, but he was actually just that very day working on a memo explaining to the SVR why we had gotten access to those sections of the Comintern archive, explaining that no one in the archive realized there was intelligence-related material in those sections of the archive, and assuring the SVR that those particular sections had been closed to research. Those particular sections, the Russians have numbers for their collections. This one was FON 495, Opus 74, which is one of several opusi of the Dimitrov Secretariat. Well, Opus 74 was closed after our book appeared, and it is still closed, I regret to say. From my point of view, of course, well, I already got to look at it, so I'm in great shape, but I do hope that they will reopen it at some point. There's also some intelligence-related material that we found in the American Party archive, and again, I think it was simply overlooked. For example, there is a copy of a stolen State Department letter. It is a letter from William Dodd, our ambassador in Berlin in 1935, to President Roosevelt. I know, 1936, I think it was, 36. To President Roosevelt, among other things, reporting on recent conversations he had had with some leading officials of Hitler's government regarding a variety of issues of interest to the U.S. Now, William Dodd did not habitually send copies of his letters to the American Communist Party. This was a stolen letter, but it is simply a typed letter that if you didn't know who Dodd was and you didn't know what was going on, there's no reason for you to know that that was a stolen letter. So whatever Russian archivist had organized this collection had simply put it in a file for 1936 dealing with correspondence of the American Communist Party's headquarters, and had no knowledge that it was intelligence related. But clearly it was. It was also, by the way, date stamped. It had gotten into the hands of the American Communist Party about 3 months after it had gotten to the U.S. State Department. There was also a similar kind of letter which quoted from some correspondence between our ambassador in France and the Undersecretary of State regarding diplomacy in Europe at that time, where whoever had took the documents had quoted from what our ambassador said, quoted from what the Undersecretary said, and then commented on its significance. It appears to have been a source in the State Department because it was habitual in those days for that kind of correspondence when it came to the State Department to be passed around among high-level staff for everyone's information. So, so the ambassador's letter and the Undersecretary's comments would have passed through the hands of several people for their information. But one of those persons turned over copied sections of it and turned it over to the Communist Party.
Next question.
In regard to getting additional information, I gather that the Venona files have not been totally translated. Is anyone continuing to work on that? Question 2, are any of the Soviet or Russian archives open now to you?
Well, the National Security Agency closed down the Venona project as an operational project in 1980 because it no longer had operational value for American intelligence purposes, because all the messages by that point were too old and it no longer served any useful purpose. Perhaps if they were to reopen the project and tried to decipher more, they could do more, perhaps. But as far as I know, they have no plans to do so. I mean, they're not in the history business of deciphering things for historical purposes. I wish they were, but they're not. And indeed, signals intelligence is an area where the people involved are quite sensitive about security matters for good reasons, for their purposes, good reasons which historians find, from our point of view, frustrating. We would like very much to look at the original messages in the original Russian rather than just the final English translations. So far, they have refused to provide that as well. The FBI has also been very reluctant to release very much of their investigative files about the process of identifying a number of the cover names. They've released some, but not nearly all. And we, of course, would be delighted in looking at all of it. As for the Russian archives, now, as I said, some sections of previously open archives are now closed. But the ones, for the most part, the archives that were open remain open, and the ones that were never open remain not open. The GRU's archives are still not open. The KGB archives are still not open. I no longer think that they will be closed forever, because I once thought all of their archives would be closed forever, and obviously I was wrong about that. So at some point, I hope more of the intelligence archives will be opened up over there. But I really don't expect it anytime soon. And let me add one of the, I mentioned that in my earlier discussion. In part, it's an institutional reason. One of the reasons why the Central Party Archive, what is now the Russian Center for the Storage and Study of Documents of Recent History, is open, is that it was a party institution. It belonged to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. That party no longer exists. It was dissolved when the Soviet Union fell apart. There are new Russian communist parties, but they are, while in a certain sense heirs of that party, they are not the same institution. They don't own that archive. That archive became an orphan after the collapse of the Soviet Party, and was taken on by the Russian state as a state archive. But essentially, there is no institution that owns that archive aside from just the whole Russian state in general. So there's no institution that is pushing to maintain secrecy. In contrast, remember the Russian intelligence agencies, Russian military intelligence, and Russian foreign intelligence are heirs of their Soviet-era counterparts, and they regard the Soviet archives as their archives. And they have institutional reasons not to open them up, except on a selective basis as they please. And so I think it'll be much longer before we see a general opening of those archives.
I'd like to thank you all for coming today. Dr. Haynes, I'd like to thank you very much. Of the book are on sale outside, and Dr. Haynes will be in the back answering more questions and signing more copies. Thank you.
Thank you. Talk longer than I intended.
No, that's all right. That's all right.
What aspect are you writing on?
The origins of the Central Intelligence Agency.
just talked to my publisher this morning, and he said they'll
Not
file
good
it out
about
next year.
by a British author, and he was a code maker in World War II for the.
Well, I'm sure you're eager to actually see it
See the drop.
Yes,
Agents by sabotage agents, SOE.
my name is
He could break codes, but he designed the codes for the agents. In fact, Bletchley Park was later somewhat chagrined when he was turned down as being a not very likely candidate for the mathematician. In the order of
Me?
and so
No.
he went over to SOE.
Plenty of people make suggestions to me, and a lot of them seem, well,
For
they're
instance,
possible,
one
but
time
I
had
I don't know.
silk. That's where the silk comes in. Either the agent had a choice of cyanide or.
I spoke to Meredith Garner, one of the decoders, yeah.
He was the first one to become aware that the Germans had gained control of the whole British apparatus in Holland. Because
Yeah. Yes, sir.
This could assign it to me. I'm Ted McNelly is my name. McNelly. Okay. I knew Sam Chu during the war.
Oh, did you?
Security agency, and he was my English instructor. I was in Wisconsin before the war. Is he still alive, do you know?
I don't know. Cecil Phillips spoke very highly of him, but I don't remember whether he told me whether he was still alive or not.
Jerry Clark, C-L-A-R-K.
Jerry
How much?
with a J?
J-E-R-Y. I was meant to ask you, how much did you get into the actual technical aspects of breaking the code?
Well, let me tell you,
I know that there
we
was
go
a-
into some of the technical aspects of the construction of one-time pad and that. But let me tell you, even though Cecil Phillips and some of those other guys explained to me several times exactly how they figured things out, I couldn't follow their
Well,
explanation.
apparently they went back over it and over again with different people.
Yeah, but let me tell you, we don't go into that too far because I never understood it.
Yeah. Well, I don't either, but it's fun to read about.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
As Max Friedman, I owe you with problem documents. You helped me on the only one of those papers.
Friedman,
Friedman, yeah.
F-R-I-E-D.
IED. I've been doing work on the War Production Board for Justice. And we got Crowell and Magdorf and a whole bunch of others on various lists, trying to show where they showed up. Plus a lot of others that I picked up.
Well, worthwhile project.
So you still over at the Library of Congress Master Building?
Yeah. Where I am.
Hopefully I'll get to you sometime this
Good.
Hi, how are you?
I'm Christopher Fry. I'll give you that so just you can
Okay.
follow along there. I'm one of Leo Rebuffo's graduate students at George Washington.
Oh, yeah. He's a very good historian.
He's a good guy all around. Very supportive of students' work.
His book, The Old Right, is excellent. Reads it a lot.
Thank you.
Oh, well, who is Colonel Grenady?
He is a direct descendant of General Clara, who chased Napoleon out of Russia with his Cossack. As my husband says, there's always been a Clara in an army somewhere. Our son is active duty now. This way, somebody asked my husband, my son can have a book. I think you will enjoy it.
Well, I hope he does.
I know. Thank you.
I just have a question about the Dodd story was interesting. Wasn't one of Dodd's daughters later a Soviet defector who ended up spending the rest of her life in Prague?
Yes, she's in the book.
Oh, okay. Because I just stumbled upon her, while looking for something else, I stumbled upon her papers at the Library of Congress.
Yeah, yeah.
I thought that was a fascinating tale that she, of all people, would have ended up.
Yeah, well, she's a fascinating person. There are some Venona messages about her. There's more material in Weinstein's book regarding her.
Okay.
Pages of writes about Mr. Hemmer regarding her book.
very fascinating story.
Because as soon as you mentioned this one particular letter, to Roosevelt, I thought to myself, maybe it went through her?
Well, in this case, from the circumstances, I think it was from the State Department to the American Public Affairs concur. Because particularly when it's associated with the other document where it's clear it was it has the Undersecretary of State's comments on the letter. But it's after it arrived here.
Okay.
That it was taken. I think both of them.
John Earl Haynes has served as the 20th century political historian at the Library of Congress. He co-wrote this book, Venona, Decoding Soviet Espionage in America, with Harvey Clare. The book is published by Yale University Press, and you can find more information on their website, yale.edu/YUP.